Now to that unsurprising but stunning record. For the 12th year in a row, the number of people around the world forced to leave their homes has risen now to a record 120 million. It's a number which is remarkable in itself, but also throws up very big questions about how their suffering and insecurity can be dealt with and about how the places where they end up should respond. The research was carried out by the UN Refugee Agency, the UNHCR, and the report shows that conflict in Sudan has displaced 9 million people in the last year, while in Syria, nearly 14 million are still unable to return home. With more on this, I'm joined now in the studio by David Habba from ActionAid Nigeria, which is an NGO that works with people living in poverty and exclusion here in Nigeria and around the world. Thank you very much indeed for coming in.
Thank you so much for having me.
So what's driving up these numbers? I imagine it's a combination of factors in terms of new crises and those protracted conflicts that don't appear to have any political solution.
Certainly. There are a range of factors that are driving these displacements, and chief of them would be armed conflict. Around the world, there have been emerging conflict, there have been protracted crises, many of whom have refused to solutions. And you can say that this is as a result of perhaps a lack of political will, because I don't think resolving conflict is rocket science. We can resolve these conflicts. So there are a number of conflicts around the world, and very sadly, a number of these conflicts have not received adequate attention, either from the media or from government, as they should. An example is the Sudan crisis. It is a hugely underreported crisis. The number of people who have been displaced in Sudan is staggering. The conditions of people in that country is, from those who are affected by the conflict, it's alarming. And it doesn't receive as much media attention as well as the focus from donors, from governments as it should. The same thing applies in Nigeria. In Nigeria, we also have staggering numbers of people who are displaced. There are people who are displaced that do not even know that they are displaced, because there's a conflict in my place. I moved to stay with my brother and my sister. They do not consider themselves displaced, but they are displaced people, right, living in communities, living with relatives, and who have considered it like one of the natural things that God has allowed to happen to them.
Well, I'm going to come to Nigeria, because obviously that affects us. I mean, we're here in Nigeria, but yeah. You mentioned Sudan. Where else are these numbers manifesting the most? Because I expect that the fresh misery we've seen in the last year in places like Gaza, for example, and possibly Ethiopia would add to those numbers.
Certainly, they do add to the numbers. Gaza, Yemen, Syria, Ethiopia.
Possibly even Afghanistan.
Yes, and the DRC. They are fresh emerging conflicts. Always and every other day we are hearing and getting reports of new conflicts that are coming up around the world, and they are contributing to those huge numbers that you're receiving.
And would it be fair to say that the main driver, I think you touched on this earlier, why people flee is still war and conflict, though increasingly, I understand we're seeing climate change as a factor as well.
Yes, the chief, I said, would be armed conflict, but there are other reasons why people get displaced. There are criminal activities that lead to displacement. We have a lot of them in Nigeria. Of course, there's also the economic induced displacement. When economic situations do not favor people, they have to move. And when they move, they are displaced. There are also incidences of climate change, like you mentioned. There are incidents of communal clashes that do lead to displacement. But the huge numbers are coming from armed conflict.
Right. Well, let's talk about Nigeria a bit more. Is it still included in those numbers the UN released? Because at one stage, we had lots of people displaced by Boko Haram, herder-farmer clashes, and of course, natural disasters such as flooding.
Yes, the numbers are included. And I wish I was sitting here to say that the numbers have reduced. The number of people who have been displaced have reduced in Nigeria, but sadly that's not the case. 10 years ago, it was in the northeast of Nigeria. But today, there's the northwest, there's north central. There are people in the southeast who have left their communities and sadly have left with them the history, the culture that they experience. And there are many people who cannot go for Christmas to their homes. And it's across the country. There is no state in Nigeria now that does not have some form of people who have been displaced. Because when people are displaced, they move to where they find they have relatives, they have friends, or they're able to receive some form of assistance. And they're all over the place. They're in Lagos, they're in Abuja. There are huge numbers of people displaced and living in host communities in Abuja. And it's contributing to the increase in crime, even in Abuja, as you can find. That's
a good point that you make there. And of course, in terms of the bigger displacements, as a result of war and conflict, many of those displaced people end up in the poorer countries that border the conflict zones, and those countries often bear the burden. I mean, Sudan, for example, you have a lot of people fleeing to Chad from Nigeria during the Boko Haram and other disturbances. You had people crossing into Cameroon, Niger, and all the rest of it. And yet some of the sharpest debate is among richer countries in the West who don't want refugees coming to their countries. What do you make of the sort of approaches to solutions that governments in the West are adopting at the moment?
And that's where I talk about a sincere political will and commitment from everyone, because this is not a problem of West Africa, it's not a problem of the poor country of the third world, it's a problem of humanity. And the feelings for us resolving this thing is it should be a dent on the conscience of our collective humanity. The truth is, because people want to preserve their existence, as it were, they are losing humanity. And of course, the implementation of policies like the externalization of borders, where the borders of Europe do no longer exist in Europe, but they now exist somewhere in Libya, and those kinds of things do not respect human life. These policies do not speak for international conventions, for instance, that say that people who are in distress should be accorded support and respect and dignity of life. These are, I would say that the responsibility for ensuring that displaced people do have a life of dignity and they are supported falls on every one of us.
The problem, of course, is that there's a thin line, certainly from the Western point of view, between people who are actually displaced as a result of conflict and have become refugees and economic migrants.
The life of a person, it's someone who is running away either from conflict or from economic situations. They are all trying to survive, and it's important that you accord them whatever support that they do require. It's very important to consider the factors that are pushing them, whether it be the economic or conflict, and ensure that we address those drivers.
Sure.
It's important to look at them holistically.
Well, now that we've got you here, I was actually reading somewhere that as Nigeria was marking Democracy Day yesterday, a number of ActionAid activists who were peacefully protesting were arrested. Tell us more about that.
A number of people who are affiliated with ActionAid or who are groups that work with ActionAid, because we work with a range of groups across the country that were arrested. But the thing we'd like to emphasize on to say is that the right of expression is a right that you cannot take away from people. The right of association, the right for people to air their views. And
but what were they doing? What were they protesting against?
There are a range of issues that they were talking about. They're talking about the issues of security. They're talking about the issues of economic justice. They're talking about the issues of because our country is going through a tough time at the moment, and of course the citizens owe it to themselves to be able to speak up. And I think what was happening yesterday was people talking, and it was not just groups that you would say affiliated to ActionAid that were on the street, but it was citizens, I think.
Right. And where was that? Where did that happen? Those arrests?
I think there was a case in Lagos and a few instances in Abuja, and yeah.
Right. So what are you guys doing about that?
I think ActionAid as an organization continues to push for people's rights. We are very concerned about the rights of people, and as a rights organization, we will always say that people have a right to association, a right to expression, to be free to associate with whoever they want to associate with themselves with.
Okay, David, I want to thank you very much indeed for coming in. David Habba is from ActionAid Nigeria, which is an NGO that works with people living in poverty and exclusion here in Nigeria and across the world. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for having me.